But here in studio, not long ago, the former President John Dramani Mahama has been speaking out of perhaps the biggest financial scandal in the country. That is, altogether, we're looking at over 420 financial institutions that have been shut down. A breakdown of this will be 9 banks, 347 microfinance and microcredit institutions, and at least 23 savings and loans institutions here in this country. The complaint, basically, is from the former president that we could have done this with other means, and that has brought untold hardship to Ghanaians as well as severe social cost to many Ghanaians too. Of course, he says this has dealt a significant blow to the local banks, and this is a threat to our national security. One person who perhaps understands this system and this sector more than many in this country is a man who formerly held the office that was supposed to be making sure that all of this is sanitized. Dr. Johnson Esiama, you're welcome.
Thank you.
I hope you are doing well.
I'm doing very well. It's good to see you again.
Yes, great to have had you here. I mean, we've spoken about this previously.
Yes, we touched on.
Was there really a need for the former president to touch on these issues? Mindful of your experience in the office.
I haven't even listened to whatever he said. But you know, politicians are always politicians. They have to do what they do. I'm not in a position to say whether he should have done it or not.
Okay, now.
Yesterday I had a conversation with George where I made my views known on a number of issues.
He's made some claims on this. He says it's brought untold hardship and economic hardship to people and has severe social cost. Is this true?
Well, the depositors will tell you what they are going through. I haven't had my money locked up anywhere. I don't have it anyway.
Okay.
But I can understand there are, you know, very, very, very severe difficulties people are going through.
He also talks about some, what do they call it? This is a threat to national security. You've been at the central bank before.
It is. It is.
It is a threat.
And I do believe that, look, you know, it's important to have a significant proportion of your financial sector in the hands of your locals. It is. It could be a national security problem because, remember, foreign capital can always go. And what happens? You know, in terms of the balance of payments, you know that when foreign capital comes into your country and invests, they have to repatriate, you know, their profits. When they do that, you know, your BOP ends up in a deficit. So foreign capital mustn't replace, you know, your local capital.
Now, there are some points he raised, some policy directives, and I'm going to run them by you if it's okay with you. First, he says we should consider temporarily freezing of banking licenses.
Absolutely, I'm for it. And I mentioned it yesterday with George as well. You know, if you just think of the job of a governor, you are the chairman of the board. Then you are also in charge of issuing new licenses. Now, when people apply for new licenses, the banking law specifies how to handle those applications. But you know, beyond that, there would always be some pressures here and there. I mean, think about pressures even from your own family. Think about pressures from your own circle of friends. It could be, you know, pressures politically. It could be anything.
Okay.
And so I am of the strong view that there needs to be some sort of control going forward. And I'm sure the current managers, my colleagues who are there right now, if they'll be frank with you, they will tell you that yes, you know, there's always that people want it done. I mean, they will not force you. But then there should be a way to exercise some control. We shouldn't just leave the job to the central bank governor to determine. Currently, given that we have 23 banks after the you know, the reforms, my idea would be to contain that number.
That should be just 23.
Just keep it at 23 for a while. What you have to do is to develop the other segments of the financial services, you know, sector.
And is this only for universal banks, or it will include the other sectors?
Well, that's 23 universal banks. But then you want to have some other players in the industry, some savings and loans. You want to have some microfinance players. You also want to have some other, you know, segments, you know, seeing to the financial needs of these other people in society. Because make no mistake, the major banks cannot do the job. And beyond that, you know, we have an objective to, you know, promote financial inclusion. You can't expect the 23 banks, you know, to provide that. So you always will need the non-banks, you know, to be at play. The rural banks and the likes, they have a contribution to make. And so personally, when I observe all these, I was telling myself, I just hope that we don't take away that sector of the financial services sector.
Okay, so we should allow the other sectors to have more coming in, but not the universal bank. And if that's what I'm getting from you.
Yeah, what I'm saying is 23 universal banks, fine. If they are strong and tidy, yes, for now, that is fine.
Okay.
But then I would want to have stronger savings and loans. I want to have stronger microfinance institutions. I want to have stronger, rural banks.
Okay.
Currently, there's so much tension. I hear the rural banks are filling the branch. And you see, it's difficult to make a distinction between a strong financial institution and otherwise. Because any institution that experiences a run on it, when there are anxieties, etc., usually will go down. So that's why for me, I say there's nothing like a strong financial institution.
Okay.
They are specialized institutions. They are highly leveraged, and the least negative news has the capability to put them down. And so I just pray that the rural banks, will be able to withstand the pressures, will be able to grow them. The remaining microfinance institutions will be able to administer them properly, so that they continue to, support the rural banking services that should be provided, while the major banks concentrate on the big core businesses.
And that form of regulation will be important going forward. But there's also a point he made about, he says, if he's made president today, he would encourage as many banks as possible to list on the Ghana Stock Exchange within as short as possible time.
Absolutely. I buy into that. I buy into that. One of the advantages when a bank lists on the Ghana Stock Exchange, you see, there are demands, there are requirements, there are reporting, demands. It takes a lot of effort for institutions to remain listed on the Ghana Stock Exchange. So that provides that additional, burden on them to clean up their acts, because our banking supervision department, yes, they do their on-site, they get these returns monthly, etc. But then if the firm is listed on the exchange, for me, you can be sure that, yes, it's better regulated than if it's not.
So it's another layer of regulation.
It's another layer of regulation. And don't forget,
not that a compounding layer that will make it cumbersome for them to be.
It doesn't
not a conflicting layer of regulation.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. But remember, one of the governors, sits on the board of, SEC.
Yeah.
So we have that working relationship among ourselves. And so I don't think there are any conflicting, regulation in there. It's rather supportive, in my view, and we should encourage that. If we can have all banks on the Ghana Stock Exchange, I don't think we will go through the kind of problems that we had.
No, but that's an interesting, but why wasn't this done before?
Oh, getting banks listed on the exchange takes a while. It takes a lot of effort. And
did it ever come up?
No, we couldn't have achieved that. You see, remember the difficulties we had from 2012. Those were not times to discuss, listing on the stock exchange. When banks are having to make greater and greater provisioning, they are getting weaker and weaker each month that they have to revise their provisions. You are aware of the causes, the factors that cause those difficulties. And so not many of them. Currently, I'm not sure how many number, in terms of numbers that we have listed on the stock exchange. But once these issues are over, I think we should encourage that as many of them as possible must get listed on the exchange. And you know why I like that also? It gives another avenue for those who want to own banks. If you have the money, you don't necessarily have to, do an application to the governor to say, I want to set up a bank. Just go through the Ghana Stock Exchange and buy majority shares in whatever bank that you want. Okay, so you can effectively you can still own a bank without going through going for a new license. And some time ago we were complaining. We were saying, why is it that all Ghanaians want to set up a new bank? Whereas you can still go through the Ghana Stock Exchange. You may not buy 100% of shares, but once you are able to obtain controlling interest, then effectively you've taken over that bank.
Is there a thinking that having to own banks is a very bad idea? Setting up new banks is not so much because of the current happenings. Is that not a way of curtailing our quest to grow our financial sector? Because really, if you set up new banks, people will get jobs to do at the least of it.
No, but if you grow existing banks also, it also expands. It's the same thing. I mean, why do you set up a new small bank that employs only 10 or 15 people when you can take over a bigger bank, turn them around, double them, you know, and achieve some economies of scale? But it will be, that policy has to be, you know, it will support, you know, each other. Okay. It will support each other in the sense that you are not shutting the door on new license altogether. And I believe the former president wasn't saying that it will be permanently shut.
No, he says temporarily.
He said temporarily.
Yeah.
That's the job.
But we don't know how temporary this is.
Well, it could be 2 years, it could be 3 years, it could be even 1 year. No one knows. However, where we are, there needs to be some sort of control, in my view. And so I agree with him. So long as there is still that avenue of entry. Because
the current operators, the people running the, what they call the banking sector, said that at least for the 23 that are running, they are clean, they are good, they are wonderful. They actually say that they actually clean up the sector, so pretty soon they'll be done with the cleanup.
Right.
It suggests that you don't think that the sector is completely clean, so we need to halt and still observe the system. Is that what you think?
No, what I'm saying is, yes, out of the 23, you know, about 5 or 6 or so have still not met, you know, the required capitalization. And so the process is still on. So you want to hold the brakes at this point. You want to make sure that all 23, and not just, you know, probably, you know, -5, not just 17 or 18 of them, for a couple of years until you are sure that you have that space for an additional bank, and then you may open the door. So it has to be discussed in terms of how long you want to hold the brakes. Now, while you do that, you have to provide an avenue for people to still come in. You don't shut the door completely. You say that, well, if you want to take over a bank, you are fine to do it, but then just go through, call up your stockbroker, and it's done. This is normal practice elsewhere. Call up your broker and take a majority shareholding in whatever bank you want. You still can take them over.
Now, there's a development, and you seem to think that both the temporary freezing of new bank licenses and the listing on the stock exchange are good ideas from the former president.
I buy into it.
Okay, now there's this part to do with receivership and liquidation framework, what do you call it, being put in the act to make it easier for the administrator to reverse a decline rather than making it automatic for an insolvent bank to be liquidated.
Right. You know, I was observing the way the whole process was playing out since Unibank and Co were liquidated. Now, you know, we set up the law. We did the law at 930. Yes. We did it. So for me, it's like
in 2016.
Yes. So while it was being applied, I was actually observing how well it was playing out, whether it was achieving its purpose. It's like I have manufactured a vehicle and you are using it to climb a mountain. So I am standing and observing the performance of the vehicle. And one of the things I noticed was that, you see, when you want to resolve a bank, it doesn't mean that you want to close it down. We have to get that clear. If a bank goes into insolvency, you know, and therefore you have to step in, the law says appoint an administrator.
For 6 months.
For 6 months. Now, the purpose of that administrator is to see whether he can turn things around. If after 6 months he's not able to turn things around, he writes a letter to the governor. And that is where the decision is made that, look, just liquidate it and appoint a receiver. So I was observing the whole process, and I noticed one thing. First of all, there is room. You can see that it's easy for the conflict of interest thing to play in. Why? Because there's nothing in the law that says if you are appointed an administrator, you don't become automatically a receiver at the end. Because anybody would do it. I mean, if I'm looking for a job and you pay me fees as the administrator, at the end of the day, it's in my interest to
finally take over.
Exactly. I must get more fees. You know, it must go into liquidator, you know, ship, and then I'm appointed a receiver. I'm not saying that, you know, that essentially is what happened.
You are not saying that's what happened in the case of
I believe that matter is in court, and so I'm not making any pronouncements on that. I'm just saying
that in order to fix what you consider to be a lacuna.
Exactly. The way the law is, there's nothing there that prevents that kind of you know, event. And so we need to fix that.
Okay. So the solution will be, first, don't ever let the gentleman who's in there as administrator become the receiver.
That is it. And that has to be in the law. That has to be in the law. If it's not in the law, it becomes a bit difficult because
it was not
the person
contemplated as of the time you were putting it together.
Well, you know, to be frank with you, when we did that law, there's a clause there that placed a moratorium of 6 months.
Yeah.
And so we knew in 2016 that we wouldn't have to activate the liquidation, the resolution section until April 2017. So when people say, why didn't you close banks in 2016? I said, what regulation do you want me to use? We passed the law in September 2016. There's a 6 months of moratorium. It takes it to March, end of March 2017. And you want me to use it to close a bank in 2016? They just go to court and set my decision aside.
Okay, that sounds
And so that again gave us another, if you like, constraint, which means that make sure no bank becomes insolvent. Otherwise, when that happens, you are forced to move into resolution. And what law are you going to use? So we were actually envisaging that no matter what, by April 2017, the issues with the banks that we had identified would have to be resolved.
I see.
And so we wouldn't have to activate that process.
So
one other thing
So let me cap this point. You're saying that a review of the current Act 930, which will make it impossible for the administrator appointed by the central bank
to become a receiver,
to try and fix a bank that's almost in crisis, cannot become the receiver.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that has to be explicit in the law.
And this is to cure exactly what?
Exactly, it's to cure the chances of a conflict of interest situation arising.
Okay.
Of course, it has to go to court, etc.
I get you.
It's like shut your door so that no thief enters. It makes it simple.
Okay.
And then one other thing I observed during the process was that if you remember the way the Unibank administration was handled, you would wonder whether in reality attempts were made, to sort of reverse the decline. I say that because I remember when they went there, one of the administrators, is my friend, and so we're having conversations backdoor. And I remember I was suggesting that bank had somebody behind it. There was an elephant in the room, and you know what I'm talking about. Yes. There was a key figure behind it.
Dr. Kaladu.
That's it. I mean, a lot of business that went to that bank, somehow, not because it's involved, but then somehow his stature, how do you put it? His name, sort of facilitated some of the businesses. And so I said, why don't you hold a media event and let all the depositors, the Ghanaian public, see you, and also the man in your midst. You're facing the media, you're saying, look, we're trying to fix this bank, and then return it to the owners and so forth. We're going to do A, B, C, D, and therefore nobody has cause to remove his or her money from the bank. Now,
to avoid the panic.
To avoid the panic.
Yes.
The depositors, once they see that figure seated with you, they believe your story. But you see, nothing of the sort was done. And so it became just payment, withdrawals, daily withdrawals. And you can check with Bank of Ghana how much liquidity support had to come in just to support that process. I'm told for after the first 3 days when the administrator went in there, I'm told over 600 million left the bank.
These were depositors' cash that they came for.
Yes, exactly.
Fearing that the bank would collapse eventually.
Was going to collapse. And so I asked myself, if it had to take all that, then you might as well have just liquidated the bank from day one. Rather than going into the administration, you don't really do anything to sort of turn them around, and then you have to wait for 6 months, constant withdrawals, and all that is what has added up to the 5-point-something billion that we are talking about.
That's interesting.
And so the point I'm making is we need to look again at the law. How can we, make it possible? Because no matter what, any bank can go into difficulties. Big banks have gone into difficulties. The Queen's Bank, Barings Bank in the UK has gone down. That is the nature of things. Banking crisis, they happen in even the most advanced countries.
Very much so, but when there are governance issues,
we'll come to that. But the point I'm making is that any bank can have difficulties. Let's not, we need to get that right. Any bank can have difficulties. Deutsche Bank is a German bank. They've been having difficulties for 5 years now consistently. But Germany is not liquidating them. You know why? Because, there are implications if you allow it to go down. And they are looking at the cost of that. So the government, the German government, prefers to keep it going for 5 years now. You know, examples are elsewhere. So the fact that a bank has difficulty does not mean that you liquidate it. It only means if it becomes insolvent, let it go into, you know, administration. But if the administrator cannot fix the problem, then it is you appoint a receiver.
Are you not avoiding the fact that the Bank of Ghana had explained clearly that it was consistently in touch with Unibank? In fact, to them, Unibank made misrepresentations. How do you deal with such a situation?
Well,
when,
you know,
throughout it all,
I was still in office. You know, they kept me in office for a while, and I'm grateful they did.
Interesting.
Yes, I'm grateful they did, even though we did not handle that process well. And I think that is why some of these things have arisen. The Unibank story, it's a very strange one. Yes, some things probably were not reported clearly. But you see, for me, this is a bank that had operated for over 15 years. And they had never showed such a problem. And so when those, you know, perceived difficulties, you know, come up, you don't have cause to doubt them. So it wasn't until some of those, you know, things began to pop up that we sat up and said, well, we need to look more closely. But then the corporate governance issues, you know, were key in the Unibank problem. We were not sitting down. In fact, I can tell you on authority that it was because of Unibank that we started a corporate governance, you know, guidelines. What was issued later on by the current governor. No, we did that. We did about 90% of that guideline.
Okay.
We completed work on it somewhere in November 2016.
But it wasn't issued.
And we said it wasn't issued because I said we should seek the comments from the IMF.
Okay.
So it was sent to the IMF. The comments never came until after the elections. And you know, right after the elections, the new political authorities sent word that we should cease
all operations in that direction.
You know, policy operations in that direction. And so they waited until the new governor came and they sent the comment. So
my point was to point out to you that case had some peculiarities and that it is more like an isolated case somewhat. Won't your request for a review of the law be based on something that looks like a single incident less likely to be repeated?
You know, once it has happened, chances are that it may happen. History, you know, you can't rule that out.
Okay.
So the point I'm making is the key thing here is when an accident, you know, occurs, you try to use the event to prevent a recurrence.
Yeah.
If it means, you know, fixing the car once again, putting in some additional whatever balances, you do it. And so for me, throughout this exercise, and I've been idle because I don't have a job now, I'm unemployed. So the only thing I do is looking at that act every day and seeing how well we have applied it, whether the next time we have to do a resolution of banks again, you know, we can go through without these issues, whether an administrator will be able to turn a bank around and restore it. Because for me, that is the best. If the administrator is able to turn it around and restore it to health, you don't have to make use of any, you know, taxpayers' money or whatever. Are you understanding? You're able to save people's jobs, businesses. You know, it's very painful to see a business collapse, and I'm telling you, because it's not easy to start a business. And so you have to do everything as much as possible. The fact that Unibank was misrepresenting some of the things, etc. For me, looking back, I would say, you know, probably we should have separated the sinner from the sin. You know, if we said it was a corporate governance problem, yes, address that corporate governance problem. But then do everything possible to see if you can preserve the business. If it means getting the business to change hands, you could do that. In other words, do everything possible so as not to automatically go into liquidation and then you have to apply, you know, taxpayers' money, etc.
You mentioned panic. In fact, the former president insisted that central bank officers and its appointees made comments and utterances that created a panic that worsened the situation. Was it just related to the Unibank case, or generally it was the case everywhere? You
know, the one rule is that when you are going to take an action on a bank, you don't announce it earlier. I was in the Bank of Ghana when we announced Cooperative Bank, all right?
Yeah.
When we closed down
housing and
exactly bank for housing and so forth.
And
I had then just
someone to 2000.
Yes. I had then just joined the Bank of Ghana. I was then with the Banking Supervision Department. And I remember how that was handled. We never told them that next month we are coming after you. We didn't. As soon as the decision was made, I remember, I think it was Mr. Asido Mante, who was then the head of BSD. He sent a couple of us to just go and get some information at the bank, you know, and we were not even told why we were going for that information. And so we just went, presented our letters, got that information. But apparently they were looking for certain details.
Okay.
The salaries for the managing director and some other things. So we did it quietly. And so that morning, the team just moved in.
Okay.
But the moment you give a sense, you know, you let them know that you are coming after them within some time frame, then people begin to pull out their monies, and that actually makes things
very
more
difficult to do.
So, well, you have to do everything possible to avoid, a run before you move in there.
Former President Mahama also suggested that, of course, he was asking that question, but since you understand how the operations of the central bank is done, he asked what due diligence was done before the Bank of Ghana commenced what it did with the various banks and the financial institutions. Do you think that there is some lack of information, one, two, or that it is apparent on the face of what has happened that there was no real and in-depth due diligence done?
Now, probably what he means there, because our staff had been working on them, and so in terms of data, they had data, good data. But probably what was missed, in my view, was that, you see, you have to make a decision whether the bank is systemically, important or not.
Okay.
Systemically important in the sense that if that bank goes down, what probability is there that it may go down with other institutions? How interconnected are they with the rest of the financial sector? I'm not sure that was done before, those decisions were taken.
You don't think so?
I don't think it was done.
Is this something was expected normally to be done?
Oh, certainly. You have to determine whether the institution is systemically important or not. Then you know the full extent of the implications.
So, for example, we know that some of these banks were connected to other savings and loans companies. We know that they were also connected to other institutions.
You need to get a quantitative sense of, the level of connection.
I mean, if you say this is the normal procedure, why do you think it was not done?
Well, I cannot speak for the bank. I had left office at the time, and so probably after I left, something could have been done. I don't know, but I know something was done towards the end of last year, and I saw those results even though I was home.
Okay.
And when I saw it, I said, "Wow, I wish this came up before that exercise," because based on those results, it was clear that there was a high level of interconnectedness across.
So you're saying it was not done prior to the commencement of the exercise, but was done in the throes of the exercise, actually in the throes of the cleanup exercise?
I know something was done after the shutdowns.
Okay.
So what I'm saying is, before the actual shutdown, some quantitative assessment of the degree of interconnectedness should have been done.
And that would have been used
that would give you a sense of whether a particular bank, and I'm not talking about any particular one, whether a particular bank is systemically important or not. If the bank is not systemically important, that means you can close it down. It won't impact on the rest of the system. It gives you that comfort that, it won't cause, a sort of industry-wide, damage.
Let me understand this. Currently, the banks that were shut down, which of them, to your mind, was or is systemically important?
If I cast my mind back, I think Unibank was systemically important.
And
they were.
How do you mean by that? Is it because it's connected to UniCredit?
Well, it's there. You could see that they did transactions with even some of the savings and loans, microfinance institutions. If you talk to the receiver, and I think it became clear in the report that
you could see that
there were exactly. And so in handling such institutions, liquidation, you see, the general rule is that you go for the approach that entails the least cost. That is the general rule.
Okay.
And so for me, in dealing with that, for example, we should have looked at it. More carefully. There were other ways that it could have been done, and if you ask
which will
me,
save the bank and its connected institutions.
Exactly. Which will, you see, given that it was a corporate governance problem, yes, fire the board. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Replace the board there. And at that time, I remember Unibank had, quite a significant amount of money with government in terms of some contractors they had financed and some of these things. They had between 800 and 900 million cedis with government at the time. And I remember when the new governor came, I went to him one morning because I had observed, I was already aware of the challenges of Unibank since middle of 2016. And I went and I said, you know what? We need to talk to the finance minister to tell us what the opinion of government is. Do they want us to let this bank collapse, or we should do everything, to prop them out? And he asked me what I meant. And I said, they've been showing signs of stress for some time that we've been trying to manage. Yeah. Now, they've also been failing daily clearing. You know what I mean by daily clearing?
Yes,
all banks come for daily clearing at the Bank of Ghana each day. And so because of those persistent daily clearing, and anytime they fail in clearing, and we have to approve, that is also part of liquidity support.
I see.
So liquidity support is not carrying money on my head and going to give anybody. Anytime they come for clearing and a bank is not able to clear, there's not sufficient money in their settlement account. Once the Bank of Ghana approves that, it's like giving them a temporary overdraft. Are you understanding? So when that happens, the whole industry gets to hear. The whole industry gets to hear that Bank A is having difficulties, you are failing. And you know what happens immediately? Banks trade with each other.
Some of those
immediately, all banks begin to tell their officials, they tell their treasurers, stay off this bank. All right? Or they review their limits downwards. The big depositors get the information somehow that, look, that bank is struggling, avoid them. Now, any bank that falls into that kind of situation, in my view, will certainly go down.
Okay, I see.
So at that point, it became important for us to find a way to stop the daily clearing,
problem specifically at.
And so when I went to my boss that morning, that was my objective. I said, let's know if government really wants us to save them, then pay them the money that is with government. At the time, it was estimated at a little over 800 million.
Yeah.
And I said, even if they can pay them half of that quickly, if you have to, at the time, the new government had just come. So they said, no, we need to edit, we need to, audit some of those certificates. I said, whatever it is, do it quickly, pay them, so that we stop those daily clearing, failures. Then the counterparties will not have to leave them. The large depositors or placements, people who had made placements with them, will not come for the early redemptions, etc. Are you understanding?
I get you.
And so we did. We called the minister. He's my good friend. All right. We called the minister. So I told him we need to call the minister, and he did. So we had that meeting that afternoon, and we explained it to him. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. I don't know why. But sitting here reflecting, I think that if that day, that idea had sunk in, that would have helped. That would have helped to gradually stabilize the bank. You could fire the management. You could, do whatever. But then there are ways we could handle it. We could have converted our stock of liquidity support. We could have converted that into equity. After all, it's the same thing we did for ADB.
Okay, I get you.
Just to make sure that we separate the sinner from the sin, and also avoid the case where you have to go into a straitjacket liquidation, because it will be costly, as we've seen.
There's a question about, and the former president also raised this issue. It's come out before. It's about the Ghana Amalgamated Trust.
Yeah.
He says, lift the veil on beneficial shareholders. Is that in doubt?
Well, Raymond, maybe let me not comment on that. Did I hear that matter is in court? I think some people have gone to court over
really? I have not heard that, but...
yeah. So I think we have to tread cautiously.
Generally. But is this something that people ought to know?
For me, again, that whole thing about GAT, I ask myself, and as we sit here today, 5 banks haven't haven't met the 400 million, capitalization. You know that?
Yes, that's what we're told.
That was the very reason why we said we're not going to set it too high. Is that okay? That's why we pegged it at 230 million. And the wisdom there was that, look, previously we always, peg it at the equivalent of about $60 million, which when we checked other countries, peer countries, was on average, the case in other countries. Are you understanding?
Yes, I get you.
So at the time, the equivalent of $60 million went up to around 240, 250 million Ghana cedis. And so we did some consultations and we said we'll peg it at 230. That way, all banks will meet it. The local banks will also be able to meet it. However, we're going to implement the ICAP process. As a matter of fact, we had started work on the ICAP implementation. The ICAP would have ensured that small banks are able to operate alongside the bigger banks. We actually had an expert from the IMF who was driving that agenda. Are you understanding?
I get you.
So this was the plan that we had in place. And as a matter of fact, if we had continued that, there would have been no need for GATT. There would have been no need for 5 banks who cannot meet it. Are you understanding?
I get you.
And then going forward, I don't know, I really don't know how it's going to play out. So the beneficial ownership issue, I beg to avoid that one.
Okay, no, I get you, because the former president raised it as a very important matter. Now, let me get this point also clear from you. Because you mentioned the, of course, the minimum capital requirement in what you said. In 2018, there was a report by the Bank of Ghana. It suggested that of the 141 rural and community banks, 37, that's about 1/4, are active, but they are distressed, or in this case, folded up. And in total, we are looking at specifically some amounts ranging between 705,396 depositors money that's been distressed within the microfinance institutions and the rural and community banks. These same rural banks, they have some form of a minimum capital requirement to meet.
Yes.
And they'll be reminded this week to make sure that they do that.
Yeah.
Are we going to see a similar problem? Are we going to see what has happened in the universal banks that are repeating itself down there?
That's my prayer. I pray that doesn't happen. Because the rural banks have existed since 1976. Many years ago.
Okay.
And the objective was for them to provide banking services to the rural communities. They were meant to, render specific services. They've done, pretty well on average. But ever since I joined the Bank of Ghana in 1995, we've always had problems with some of them. Many of them have collapsed. Many of them have gone the other way. We've had different, attempts, different approaches to try and prop them up. Because many a time you notice that is a problem with the board.
Okay.
Their boards are always the problem. What they do with their investments are always the problem. So there's been different approaches to try and stem them.
Is the decision to increase the minimum capital requirement a positive one?
We did that.
Yes.
We actually started the revision of the...
It's been postponed. The implementation periods, I mean, I'm not sure they've met it consistently.
Yeah,
So
because most of them are very rural-based, community-based. You're asking them to bring 2 million Ghana cedis. It's a lot of money for them. And so you have to keep nudging. You have to keep nudging them. My point is, if you close them down, the cost of closing might rather be counterproductive. So
even though one-fourth are currently distressed.
No, see, there are some that are even not operating anymore at all.
Yes, folded up.
Let the dead lie peacefully, in their graves. But for those that are in the middle line, and then also there are a couple of them that are doing really well. Okay. In fact, I remember when those days we were thinking about looking at the very good ones and training them as role models. To see how they can teach others, because normally it's easier to learn from your peers. And so we were actually trying to create those role models among them and use them to go around and train, the others. I want to believe that the same thing is being done. But my prayer is that the same contagion doesn't, sort of sweep all of them also away. Because you see, we will continue to need the non-banks, whether we like it or not.
Okay.
And the non-banking sector mustn't collapse. We must do everything to prop them up. I'm not saying keep putting in money there. Before I left office, I actually set up a committee which was chaired by one of the former deputy governors, Mr. Asedo Mante.
Okay.
I put up that committee and said, please review the entire rural banking concept for me from inception, and advise on what we can do, to address, their problems. How can we take that, to the next level? And I have a copy of the report, even after, even though I left office thereafter. I think there, and they raised quite some very good points there, which I think that we should implement, and try to sort of, we must do everything to make sure that the contagion doesn't sink them.
12 billion for universal banks, 7 billion for savings and loans, 1 billion for microcredit institutions. The former president believes that Ghana is moving closer to fiscal distress levels. This compounded with the energy situation.
Well, where we are now, and again, it's unfortunate all those numbers are coming up now. For me, if we had continued, there was no way, we would have no way. There was just no way.
Would have spent this amount of money.
No way. There was just no, because we knew clearly what we had to do before April 2017. And I can tell you how we would have avoided it. For example, remember the ESLA bond that was issued? It was meant to clear all the 10 billion, the exposures to the banks. The mistake we did there was we did not add a sovereign guarantee. As a matter of fact, I was still in office at the time. I went to address some investors in London. They made it clear that, look, given that you are issuing this as a corporate bond, it makes it difficult for us. We're not going to buy into it. So get some government guarantee sort of to attach to it, and then we'll pick it up.
To protect it.
And I thought it was perfect because there was a bigger problem, to provide liquidity to the banks and to restore some of them to solvency. I remember I came back and I engaged some of the senior people at the time, but the idea never went through. That was a missed opportunity. If we had paid banks, all banks at the time, and if it meant raising a local bond to pay a lot of the contractors as well, that would have helped to prevent the slide into insolvency in the case of most of them. But having said that, there were, idiosyncratic problems. There were factors that were, driven mainly by some of the banks themselves.
I get you.
Those ones, you can't blame anyone.
The question I'm asking is whether or not we are currently moving closer to fiscal distress levels.
Well, not necessarily. It's possible, but not necessarily. Not necessarily because, for me, it all depends on the ability of the receiver to recoup those amounts.
Which is going at a very slow rate, actually.
Well, that is the nature of receivership. As a matter of fact, I was telling you about the law. That is why liquidation is really the last resort, because it tends to be a long process.
It's a painfully slow
It could go on for the next 20, 30 years. That's the nature of liquidation, because they have to go to court, and it depends. You can't tell when the court action will be concluded. You can't tell when the judgment will be pronounced, and you can't tell when you have to sell some assets, how soon it can be sold. It's quite a complicated process.
This almost
so I think that we all need to support the work of the receiver.
Okay.
If the receiver can, for me, if they can collect up to about 80% of the amount, that would be good.
Is that feasible?
It is feasible. I mean, some of them have assets.
Within a reasonable time period.
Within a reasonable. Remember, was it earlier this year, the current governor was actually urging them to work harder. And I think last week, the receiver mentioned that even, there's we are hearing some good news from there. And so let's all support his work. He should be able to recover, quite a chunk of that money. Because when he recovers those money, it goes to service the very bonds. Are you understanding it?
Yeah.
So we wouldn't have to necessarily spend, 12 billion or 14 billion at the end of the day. So if that happens, the fiscal distress may not happen.
Okay.
However, if the receiver is not able to recoup, that is when the fiscal distress, becomes a problem.
Are we looking into a future with more financial sector crisis, or the situation has settled and is improving currently?
You see, there are theories about financial sector crisis. There is the Minsky model. There are all kinds of theoretical models.
Yes.
Some models even predict that every 10 years, there's the likelihood that a country will experience a financial crisis. I actually tried to look at the model. I said, does it apply to Ghana? Because, this is not the first time we are experiencing bank closures. We've had
in 2000 there was.
Exactly. Yes. When we used the, NPAT and all those people. And so I was trying to look at the time gap. Do we have a 10 year sort of? You never can tell. You never can tell. And as I mentioned, Banks are highly leveraged institutions. They are taking decisions every day. Of course, there has to be strong supervision, but you never can tell. Otherwise, there wouldn't be banking crisis in the United States. There wouldn't be banking crisis in the UK. But they also do experience it. What's important is to have a good framework for resolution, so that if a bank goes into difficulty, it doesn't mean closing them, it doesn't mean liquidate them. You still have options to try and contain them, such that if they can go back to solvency, you restore them, or otherwise, you do everything possible to prevent a straight, liquidation. And that is what is important.
Was this a chaotic solution? The former president concluded on that.
Well, that is his words.
This was a chaotic solution.
That is, he calls it chaotic. That's fine. In my view,
yes.
What I would say is this solution could have been avoided. Could have been avoided. Looking back, first quarter of 2017, I'm telling you, when I
could we have saved jobs?
Yes, if you saved them, you would have saved jobs.
Would we have actually prevented the families that are currently suffering at the end as a result of this? We could have done so.
We could have. Raymond, one other thing I left out. Before the elections, just before the elections, we had a visit by the Republic Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. It's a big group.
Okay.
They're very strong. They have a lot of oil reserves, so they are strong in other continents. They came with their president and everything. Yeah. And they told us that they were willing to buy up to 5 banks in Ghana. 5 banks, and to put them together. Now, the idea, is that they wanted to establish a hub in Ghana so they can launch into the rest of West Africa.
Okay.
And I was happy when I heard that.
But it didn't happen.
Sorry?
It didn't happen.
The elections,
we know that.
It was the elections that
kettled that particular
exactly.
one. The same time is up. It's always a conversation with you that never ends. We thought we would have done shorter period than this, but we should do this again.
That's okay.
I appreciate you coming in today. Thank you so much.
Anytime.
Folks, if you did watch, the former President John Dramani Mahama actually spoke about the financial sector and the difficulties in the banking sector and the shutdowns in it. One man who knows so much about that sector is Dr. John Stesiama, who's a former Deputy Governor of the Central Bank. He joined us to put what the former president said in proper perspective and probably put some light on that. Thank you so much for joining us on today's edition. And Doc, I appreciate you coming to studio.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. How many minutes?